Common cake faults, reasons, and their remedies. There are certain cake faults which we can look from the external side. For example, color of the crust, crust texture, crust cracks, etc. Now we'll take up all these faults which are related with the external appearance. Next cake fault is cracked top. This fault is very common and this generally occurs when the oven temperature is very hot. As a result, what happens? The crust is formed very quickly when the cake is still rising, and this as a result gives rise to cake burst. However, there are many other factors also which are responsible for the cracked top, like if we use so many leavening agents, amount is more, amount of baking powder, amount of baking soda is more, or the cake tin is small, or we have added too much of the flour in the batter. The remedy for this is that we should maintain the proper temperature of the oven and right size of the pan should be used. The recipe should be followed religiously and correctly. Sunken cake is a very common fault, and this generally occurs when the temperature of the oven gets reduced during baking, or we open the oven too frequently to know whether the cake has been set or not. Or sometimes what happens during the baking, electricity goes off and the cake will sink. Other factors besides it, they include too low temperature of the oven, more quantity of certain ingredients like fat, baking powder, sugar, etc. The remedy to prevent this is that one should not open the oven many times in between to see whether the cake has been set up or not. If the cake has been kept for 30 to 40 minutes for baking, before 30 minutes we should not open the oven. We should resist to open the oven in between. Check the oven temperature so that it is proper. Follow the recipe correctly. If we look at these two pictures of the chocolate cakes and chocolate cupcakes, we find that the cakes have got sunken in the middle. They have not been cooked properly. They don't have a good volume. Maybe the mixture which we used for making the cake, that was very soft, or we had added too much of the raising agent like baking powder or baking soda, or we had added more sugar in this cake, because it looks like that when we see the top of the cake. And if oven is too hot, or if the oven is too cool, or we have shortened the cooking time, then also this kind of fault can be there, and we should modify that by preventing these mistakes. Small volume with bound appearance. This is also very common. Sometimes we do not beat the batter well. We beat the batter for insufficient time, or we do not use the given amount of sugar in the recipe, or we do not add proper amount of the baking powder in the recipe. Such cakes, what will happen? They will have a very close crumb structure and there will be tough texture. They will be tough to eat. Volume will be very low. Sometimes what happens when you bake the cake, you will find that the sides of the cake, they get burnt. They become crunchy. This generally happens when you leave the cake in the oven for a longer time. If you have to bake for 30 or 40 minutes, but you keep that cake in the oven for about 50 minutes, even if you have switched off the oven, but it is lying for a longer time in the hot oven, then also such kind of fault can occur. Or if you have added too much of fat, oven temperature is too high, instead of 180 it is 190, or the cake tin, it has not been lined properly, as can be seen from this picture. We have not used the parchment paper, it has not been lined properly, it has not been greased and dusted properly. Then the remedy is that never over bake the cake. Bake the cake for the given time period at the recommended temperature. Check the oven temperature. If it goes high, then you will get this kind of fault. Always line your pan properly and check the baking ingredients also, especially the fat. Then you can prevent this fault. Next fault is that cake gets stuck to the pan. It is very difficult to take out the cake from the pan after baking. This can be because that the tin has not been prepared properly, it has not been greased properly, or you have not lined it properly with the parchment paper or baking paper, or you have left the cake in the pan for a very long time for cooling. And the remedy is that greasing should be done, then it should be dusted with the flour, or you can line the tin with the parchment paper and that should be greased properly. Then put the batter in that, bake at the proper temperature, let it cool for 15 to 20 minutes, and then you take out from the tin over the wire cooling rack so as to complete the cooling process. Don't leave the cake after baking for a longer time in the cake tin for cooling, otherwise it will be difficult to take out the cake from the pan. Many times we find that cake crust is very dark. It can be because of too hot temperature of the oven, or we have not added water or any liquid in proper amount, or excessive amount of sugar has been added. To prevent it, we should check the oven temperature. Mostly the cakes are baked at 180 degrees centigrade, and that temperature should be maintained. It should not be very high. Then follow the recipe properly. Proper amount of water and liquid should be used. Don't use excessive sugar. Another fault is that cake gets burnt on the top, as shown in this picture. And it's very clear that if the oven temperature is very hot, or you have not placed the cake in the middle rack, you have placed the cake in the rack which is very near to the top heating element, or you have added incorrect amount of water or the liquid which dried up because of the hot temperature and the cake got burnt. To prevent it, always check the oven temperature and put the cake in the middle tray, in the middle part of the oven, and always follow the recipe correctly. Sometimes we find that cake is undercooked on the top, but it is burned beneath. It can be if the baking sheet is too large for the oven and no circulation of air because of that takes place. At least there should be a gap of 5 centimeters between the sides of the shelf and the baking sheet, so that there is a proper circulation of the air and the cake gets heat uniformly from all the sides and rises. Many times we know that the cake is shiny and sticky, and it can be if we put the cake batter in the cool oven, temperature is not up to the mark, it is not up to the required temperature, and still it is cool, it is low temperature. Or if the temperature is proper but we have not baked it for the given time period, recommended time period, or we have added too much of sugar in the cake, that will give the shiny and sticky texture to the crust. To prevent it, we should always check the oven temperature and always ensure that the cakes are well baked and use the recipe correctly. All the ingredients given in the recipe should be weighed properly. Sometimes the cake crust is too thick, and it is because of the excessive baking time. Therefore, if you don't want it, you should not bake your cakes for a longer time. Don't over bake your cake to prevent this fault. Sometimes what happens that the cake has been baked properly, it has risen very well, and you take out for cooling, but during the cooling it shrinks from the sides and from the top. It can be if you have added excessive amount of liquid in it, if the oven temperature was very hot, or you have not used the proper procedure for mixing the batter, or the cake was baked for too long a period. To prevent that cake doesn't shrink, we will have to keep in mind certain points, like we will have to follow the recipe properly, we will have to maintain the proper oven temperature, don't over bake your cake, don't over mix the batter so that aeration remains. Many people complained that their cake has not risen evenly from all the sides, and this can be because when you are mixing the ingredients, flour has not been blended well into the mixture, or the oven temperature was not even. Sometimes it was high, sometimes it was low. The oven is not working properly, or the oven temperature is very high. To prevent this fault, we will have to mix the batter properly. We will have to mix the flour well, not vigorously. We will have to mix it gently with the cut and fold method, and have to well blend it into the rest of the ingredients. Always check the oven temperature. It should be maintained same. There are certain faults which you cannot see from the outside, but when you cut the slice of the cake, then you find that the internal appearance of the cake is not good. Such kind of cake is very dense inside. Grain is dense. Maybe because enough air was not beaten up into the cake, or eggs were added too quickly. They were not added one by one and then beaten, or leavening agent, its amount is not as per given in the formula, or you have added excessive amount of liquid or water, mixing has not been done properly, they can all lead to very dense grain. To prevent this fault, you should mix the batter well, follow the recipe correctly, and do the mixing of the batter very well so that coarse and irregular grain. The size of the air cells is not proper. It happens when mixing is not done in the precise manner. Batter is stiff, oven temperature is cool, batter that has been turned too much. Therefore, we should mix the batter correctly, we should do the creaming very well, we should follow the recipe correctly, and baking should be done at the proper temperature. Many times we find that the cake has been baked properly, but when we start eating it, there is an off flavor from that. We don't feel like eating that. It can be because of many reasons. Maybe the poor quality ingredients have been used, or the equipment and the tools which have been used for baking, those were not clean, oven was not clean, improper mixing procedure was followed, and therefore we should always maintain cleanliness in the cooking area. Oven should be thoroughly cleaned. There should not be any crumbs left over from the previous baking. Batter should be mixed properly. Clean equipments and tools should be used. Good quality ingredients should be used. It's a very common complaint that when we make the fruit cakes, fruits get sunk at the bottom of the cake. They are not uniformly distributed throughout the cake. The reasons are that the fruits are too large or heavy. They have been cut in large sizes. Sugary syrup on outside the fruit that has not been washed off, and what happens that this goes along with the fruits inside the mixture, and this gives rise to such kind of fault. If you're using the canned fruits, they should be washed with water thoroughly before mixing in the cake. If you overbeat the cake, or the cake mixture is too wet so that it doesn't hold the fruit in place, or if the oven temperature is very high, in such cases the fruits get sunk at the bottom. Therefore, to prevent this, always mix the fruits with the flour. There should be a coating of flour over the fruits, and then that flour along with the fruits should be added in the batter. Always check the oven temperature. Never use too big sizes of fruits. Cut them into smaller sizes. Never overmix the batter, especially after mixing the flour having the fruits. Wash the canned foods properly before mixing with the flour. That if you're using the canned fruits and you are washing them, don't mix them flour immediately. Dry those fruits first and then you mix with the flour. For example, you are using raisins. Soak raisins for 4-5 hours, then you dry them so that there is not any kind of moisture left in that, and then you mix with the maida and put in the batter. Sticky cherries, they should be always washed off so that there is no syrup, and then you toss in the flour. Mixture should always be quite stiff so that it can hold the flour. Self-raising flour should be used instead. Another fault is that the cake gets burnt on the top, but it is not cooked in the middle. This happens when we are using a small size of cake tin for the given amount. Therefore, you will always find that in the recipe, at the end it is given that you use 8 inches pan, 9 inches pan or 6 inches pan for this recipe. The suitable size of the tin or pan should be used for the given recipe. It should not be too small for the recipe. Similarly, oven temperature should not be very hot. To prevent this kind of fault, always use proper size tin and check the oven temperature. It should be maintained properly. Sometimes you find that the cake is very dark. Again, the cake can be dark if the oven temperature is very hot. You are not using a very correct amount of water or liquid. Excessive amount of sugar has been added in that. For that, you will have to follow the recipe religiously. You will have to maintain the proper temperature of the certain general faults. Batter gets overflowed from the tin. This happens when there is wrong adjustment to the recipes. Cake tin is small, and when the batter rises during getting heat in the oven, it comes out of the pan. Therefore, right size of pan should be used and adjust the recipe properly. Poor flavor in the cake can be because of improper mixing, faulty baking conditions, not using clean equipments and tools, as I've said earlier also. Therefore, you have to maintain the batter properly, check the baking condition, clean the equipments well. Pure flavors should be used instead of imitations. Flavor should be according to the cake. For example, if you're making orange cake, add orange essence. If you're making almond cake, add almond essence. The essence or flavor used should be according to the type of cake. Many times people say that their cake has not risen very well, it is having a very small volume and its crumb is very tough. This can be because of excessive mixing, and if the batter is very stiff, it is not of the pouring consistency, insufficient amount of water or any kind of liquid has been used in the batter. Therefore, never overmix the batter and follow the recipe correctly. Proper amount of water or liquid should be used so that it is of the proper dropping consistency and it will prevent. Many times the cake crumb lacks body structure. As seen in these pictures, the body structure has not been maintained, it is crumbling. It is because of the excessive mixing, or it can be due to the excessive use of the liquid. Not to have such kind of crumbly texture, we should mix the batter properly and we should follow the recipe correctly. Close texture of the crumb. It can be because of insufficient amount of the leavening agents, or creaming of eggs and sugar has not been done properly. Fat and sugar, they should be creamed properly, and then egg should be added one by one and mixing should be done. If too heavy handling of dough has been used, then also you will find close texture of the clump. Always fold the flour using a metal spoon or a wooden spoon and fold gently by the cut and fold method. Over stirring of flour in the mixture should not be done, and only add enough liquid. Don't overdo with it. Curdling of creamed mixture, if it has happened, or if the oven is too cool, you will find close texture in the cake crumb. Sometimes you find that the shelf life of the cake is very less, it dries out very soon. It can be that if you have done the baking for more time than the required time, insufficient amount of liquid has been used, or mixing has not been done properly, mixing procedure was not proper, or it also depends upon the weather. If it is a too hot season, and not to have such kind of fault, we should reduce the baking time. Batter should be mixed properly. Follow the recipe correctly. Always wrap your cake in the cling film and place it in the airtight container so that it does not dries up. Thank you.